Thank you very much. Of course, pleasure to be here this morning. Deputy Vice Chancellors, Dean, Father Josaphat, Professor Malinowski, the directors, program leaders, lecturers, Reverend Fathers, religious men and women, students and invited guests, all protocol observed. Actually, coming into the hall, I already felt very much at home because I immediately recognized these pictures from my old homestead, so to say, in Khartoum, where I lived nearly 10 years of my life. Images out of the desert, images from churches of the then Christian Nubian kingdom of Dongola. And you can still visit those places, by the way, in the desert, along the Nile, up there to the north of Khartoum, all the way up to the Egyptian border. Beautiful places to visit, and some of these images, as you see them here, the one of Anna, I prefer very much. You also can find in the National Museum in Khartoum. And then also here the image of Christ the Pantocrator from the Hagia Sophia. We have our Turkish friends here in our midst. Witness of Christian faith and of coexistence between Christianity and Islam. So feel very much at home today, and also these images, I think they are from Chartres, the glass-stained windows, witnesses of church history of our forefathers. I come today here to give a keynote speech, and it was said that all here are very competent scholars. I don't count myself among them. I'm just struggling along a bit in church history, so don't be too critical with me if here and there I miss the mark. Because Tangaza University College thought it was wise and interesting to invite the Apostolic Nuncio, so I am not to blame if I stand here today to speak to you on this occasion where we put our heads together and reflect on the events of the First Lateran Council of 1123 and then the Black Death. The Black Death, as far as we know, myself being a European, arrived in Europe in 1347. A fleet of ships had arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily in southern Italy. And when they had put anchor, it was discovered that many of the sailors were gravely ill. They even hadn't managed to throw the dead bodies overboard. And the sick were covered with black boils that oozed blood and pus. And people were horrified at the sight, but nobody knew that this scene would repeat itself 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and would be amplified all over Europe. Over the next 5 years, more than 20 million people died before the disease subsided. And people didn't know what to do, didn't understand the origins, didn't understand how to treat it. And the only thing one could do was to put the infected persons as soon as possible into quarantine. Did you know, by the way, that the word quarantine comes from the 40 days that a person needed to isolate himself from the word quarante in French. And the port city of Ragusa, also in Sicily, did exactly that. Sailors coming into the port had to isolate themselves for 40 days on their ships before they were allowed onto land, thus slowing the disease. Meanwhile, in panic, healthy people did all they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused their patients, priests refused to administer last rites, and shopkeepers closed their stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there was no escape for the disease. In fact, it even affected cows and sheep and goats and pigs and chickens as well as people. In fact, so many sheep died during the Black Plague that the whole European wool industry collapsed. And many people, desperate to save themselves, abandoned their sick and their dying loved ones. Thus doing, the Italian author wrote, each thought to secure immunity for himself. But they didn't understand the biology behind the disease. Many believed that the Black Death was like a kind of divine punishment, retribution for sins against God, such as greed and blasphemy and heresy and fornication and worldlessness. And by this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. And some people believed that the way to do so was to purge their communities of heretics and other troublemakers. So, for example, many thousands of Jews were massacred between 1348 and 1349, and thousands more fled to the sparsely populated regions of Eastern Europe, nowadays Poland, for example, and then Russia, where they could be relatively safe from the rampaging mobs in the city. On the 6th of July 1348, Pope Clement VI issued the first of two bulls instructing Christians not to blame the Jews for the plague and epidemic then sweeping across Europe, noting that Jews too were dying from the Black Death. Clement announced that people who cast blame on the Jews had been seduced by the liar, the devil. By the way, do you remember how during the COVID epidemic we would accuse the Chinese? Pope Clement VI, born as Pierre Roger in Aquitaine, France in 1291, had been elected Pope about 6 years before the plague's outbreak in 1342. He was a trained monk, the fourth of 7 Avignon popes, who had previously been the Archbishop of Sens and of Rouen in France. And when the Black Death began striking down Christians, Clement too sought explanations. In fact, he had even a physician undertaking autopsies on victims' bodies in the hope of finding a telltale sign, and he asked his papal astronomers to look to the sky for answer in the stars. But people were also dying in Avignon, the city of the popes. They were dying so quickly that the cemeteries ran out of space, and survivors began dumping bodies in the Rhone River. Clement ordered additional burial grounds to be prepared, but he also declared burial in the water to be acceptable. He also announced that those who died without having been given their last rites as Christians would still be able to enter into heaven. The Church lost nearly 40% of its priests to the Black Death. By the way, many of you who are religious know that many of the religious congregations, especially in Europe, lost many of their elderly members as well. The English clergy died at an alarming rate, including 3 bishops of Canterbury in the span of 1 year. Monasteries suffered immensely as the plague wiped out entire religious communities, and the high percentage of clergy death because of the plague produced a shortage of priests, which the Church tried to ameliorate by lowering the minimum age of ordination from 25 to 20 years. Imagine, you could have lived at that time, you would have been a priest already. Although, understandably given the circumstances, this action produced a cadre of inexperienced, young, and poorly formed priests. The quality of the priesthood suffered, and with it the Church as a whole, as ecclesiastical abuses became widespread in the 15th century, leading, many believe, to the Protestant Revolution in the 16th century. Prior to the Black Death, across most of Europe, land was scarce and lords controlled an abundant agricultural labor force subjected to serve them, an exploitative form of labor coercion that sharply restricted freedom of employment and movement. Yet, in areas with a high death toll, the Black Death put an end to that practice, as it led to a shortage of labor that greatly improved the bargaining position of the laborers. The scarcity of labor generated intense competition among the lords for the labor of the surviving peasants. Many such peasants ended up fleeing their manors in the hope of finding better working conditions and pay elsewhere. These dynamics fundamentally changed socio-economic conditions in the areas that suffered from the highest death toll. In those areas, the system of serfdom was replaced by an emerging free labor market. And given the Lord's weakened capacity to directly administer their lands, many peasants began to work on the land collectively and to self-govern without direct oversight by the nobility. Many former serfs also fled to the cities, which led to a pattern of increased urbanization. In general, the bargaining power of laborers increased massively, while the power of those who possessed land notably declined. In numerous cities and towns, the newly gained strength by the lower socioeconomic groups also led to the institutionalization of, imagine, electoral participation. The adoption of these early forms of democracy in combination with the ability of peasants to self-govern radically altered power structures in a medieval society. Yet in areas that were only lightly hit by the Black Death, such dynamics did not unfold because labor had not become scarce. Thus, in those areas, serfdom persisted, making the adoption of proto-democratic institutions unlikely. Let us then focus on the lands of the German-speaking Central Europe, where I also come from, or the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a large but weak confederation consisting of hundreds of different local political units. Major military conflicts, such as the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, solidified the empire's decentralized organization and prevented the emergence of a centralized nation-state, which in turn gave ample space for local political traditions to persist over time. Because of this decentralization, which lasted into the 19th century, we find that even when the first federal democratic elections were held in unified Germany in the early 1870s, the historical divergence in political cultures created by the Black Death was still visible. In areas that were hit hardest by the pandemic, that is, especially Western Germany and Southern Germany, anti-democratic parties that defended the privileges of the landed elites fared poorly at the ballot box. Any semblance of a culture of deference to traditional aristocratic elites had long since eroded in those areas. Moreover, the socio-economic conditions in Western and in Southern Germany were characterized by greater equality and higher levels of urbanization, which made it nearly impossible for the landed elites to create the same kind of political apparatus they had assembled elsewhere. To the contrary, in areas where serfdom had persisted for many centuries, the nobility was politically influential, and in part because those areas had never developed robust democratic institutions and were still characterized by high levels of socio-economic inequality. There, the landed elites' unchecked use of coercion, clientelism, and intimidation allowed them to achieve significant electoral victories. And if you would look at the map of Germany of those days, you would find that Western and Southern Germany had been disproportionately gravely hit by the epidemic, while the eastern parts, going into what is nowadays Poland, had suffered much less. And therefore also it is explained that the western parts of Germany were much more democratic already in the 19th century than parts on the east side of the empire. But the story does not end there. Despite intensifying industrialization and major events such as World War I, several centuries of diverging political development could not just be shaken off so quickly. While the strength of the landed elites decreased markedly between the 1870s and the 1930s, the centuries-long inexperience that many parts of Germany had with democratic institutions was still visible in the Weimar Republic's fateful 1930s and 1932 elections. In those elections, the areas that had historically only been lightly hit by the Black Death and were serfdom had endured for many generations had significantly higher vote sharing for Hitler's Nazi party than some of the western parts of Germany. From our perspective, this likely reflects the residues of an anti-democratic political culture. And as we know well, the Nazi party's electoral success was a starting point of the darkest chapter in German history. As you can see, the developments that took place centuries ago, starting with the Black Death, can still have an influence in our times. The plague, but also our view on church and state, has been shaped and changed over the centuries. What we feel and think today is in many ways not the fruit of our individual way of thinking, but has been brought about by a long process that rooted itself in our common historical conscience. Also, the First Lateran Council in many ways was the result of a long development as well. The Council approved the Concordat of Worms, signed in Worms, Germany on the 11th of September 1123, between Cardinal Lambert of Ostia, representing Pope Calixtus II, and the then Emperor Henry V. The Emperor, after much pressure from the Church, threatening excommunication, finally caved in and signed what later came to be known as the Pactum Calixtinum. The Emperor gave up his claim to investiture with ring and crozier and granted his freedom of election to the episcopal sees. And it reminds me again, we have had a number of episcopal ordinations in this country, and so I am the one many times who has this privilege of putting the ring on the finger of the bishop and to give him the crozier. Before the Concordat of Worms, that was a thing that would be done by the emperor, in that way indicating that bishop was under the control of the emperor. But Calixtus II, the Pope, obtained the right to name bishops throughout Germany, but still did not have that power in much of Burgundy, that is in France, and in Italy. Much will be said, I imagine, about this council in the coming days, so I want to refrain from giving too much of a comment on the history and the consequences of that council. I now want to focus merely on the role of the papal envoy, like Cardinal Lambert, who had signed the Concordat of Worms on behalf of Pope Calixtus II. The tradition of sending out papal envoys was already long-standing in the 11th century. In fact, from very early on in church history, popes used to send out envoys to royal courts and important events to represent them. That happened first to the court of Byzantine, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, and nowadays Istanbul. The Pope would have a stable envoy at the court, an apokrisaris, as he was called. Apokrisaris, that is a Greek word meaning as much as the one who answers, the one who will answer on behalf of the Holy Father. In part, the role of the apokrisarius was to represent the interests of the Roman Church and the imperial court in Constantinople. In view of the great importance attaching to the relations between the popes and the imperial court of Constantinople, especially after the fall of the Western Empire in 476, and during the great dogmatic controversies in the Greek Church, these papal representatives at Constantinople took on gradually the character of a permanent legate and were accounted the most important and responsible among the papal envoys. By the way, most of them, and that is encouragement for any deacons among us, most of these papal envoys were deacons, and they were the most educated and potentially skilled in diplomatic negotiations. The apokrisarius, the papal envoy, had considerable influence as a conduit for both public and covert communications between the Pope and the Emperor. During the Byzantine papacy, 7 apokrisarius went on to be elected a pope, So there is still a chance for me to become a pope. According to one commentator, to be sent as an Apostolic to Constantinople was to graduate from papacy. When in Constantinople, the Apostolic resided in the Placidia Palace as early as the end of the Arcadian Schism in 519. With the change of the center of powers from Byzantium later on to Western Europe with the Carolingian emperors, also the envoys moved their positions. In the 9th century, the first papal envoy can be found at the courts of Charlemagne and the Carolingian descendants after him. These, however, are not deacons anymore, but royal arch-chaplains, called specifically papal envoys. And for a number of centuries, popes would continue to send out their envoys to different places for different occasions. A famous incident, and you scholars in church history, you know very well, a famous incident with a papal legate took place in 1054. Emperor Constantine IX arranged an alliance with the papacy against Normans in southern Italy. And Leo IX, the Pope, sent a delegation to Constantinople headed by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida and including Frederick of Lorraine, the future Pope Stephen IX. But the papal delegation's visit served only to worsen the tension between the two churches, between the church in the west and the church in the east. On July 16, 1054, Humbert, the papal envoy, issued a bull of excommunication directed against Cyrillarius and his followers, the then patriarch of the Eastern Church, and placed it on the altar of Hagia Sophia. It is important to note that excommunications were limited to the people involved and were not directed by the one church against the other. But Humbert had acted on his own authority, and in the meantime, Pope Leo IX had already died. In recognition of these facts, you might remember in 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athanasios revoked the excommunications of 1054 as a first step towards healing the schism between the Church. It was not an act that resolved the schism in itself. The papal envoys in many ways were first and foremost involved with spiritual and theological matters. However, in the 13th and 14th century, with the development of the nation-state, first and foremost France, it became practice to exchange stable envoys between different nations. Hence, also the Pope started to commission his envoys to different countries. Let's keep in mind that in those days, the Holy Father was not only a spiritual leader, but also a worldly leader, having control over more or less 1/5 of Italy, the so-called Papal States. And thus the papal envoy turned into an ambassador like all the others, not only representing issues concerning theology or spirituality, but also defending the interests of the Papal States. It was in the 19th century, during the reunification movement in Italy, that the popes lost their Papal States. In 1870, all these territories had been lost to the troops of Garibaldi in Italy. For the next 59 years, the popes refused to leave the Vatican in order to avoid any appearance of accepting the authority wielded by the Italian government over Rome as a whole. And during this period, popes also refused to appear at St. Peter's Square or at the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica facing it. Popes granted the Urbi et Orbi blessings from a balcony facing a courtyard or from inside the basilica, and papal coronations were instead held at the Sixtine Chapel. It was in 1929 that the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, the head of the Italian government at that time, ended the prisoner in Vatican problem, involving a unified Italy and the Holy See by negotiating the Lateran Treaty signed by the two parties. This treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Holy See over a newly created international territorial entity, a city-state within Rome, limited to a token territory which became the Vatican City, which maybe is 4 or 5.5 square kilometers. However, in all those years that there was no Vatican State, that is for nearly 60 years, the Holy See never stopped sending papal nuncios to different countries in the world. Thus, while the Vatican as a country, as an independent territory, had ceased to exist, it continued to send out diplomats. And these envoys, most importantly, were also accepted by different courts and governments in Europe and beyond. This goes to explain that the role of the papal envoy had changed again. His role not being anymore the representative of an existing country, the papal states, but of a spiritual entity, the Holy See, the Catholic Church, which comprises nowadays 1.3 billion Catholics. The existence of the papal envoy, the Apostolic Nuncio, the one who announces, that's what it implies, the one who announces the will of the Holy Father and of the Church at large, remains important in defending the independence of the Church against any attempts to curtail that freedom. And of course, the diplomacy of the Holy See is different from the art of diplomacy as practiced by other countries. The Holy See is not an economic power, though it sells quite a number of rosaries. It doesn't have an army, but it is very proud of its Swiss guards. And it doesn't have the funds available for great interventions in the humanitarian field. The Holy See's diplomacy is many times a silent diplomacy, a diplomacy that tries to build on persuasion, on building alliances with like-minded countries, in defending the principal values of the common good of justice and truth. And of course, that kind of diplomacy cannot be trumpeted around. You don't end up in the newspapers, and if you would, it's for all the wrong reasons. There's little you may have to show for in the first place. While the big powers are able to twist arms of certain smaller countries, that will never be the case with a papal envoy. His diplomacy will take place behind closed doors, and needs a lot of patience and building up of relations, sometimes over many months, if not years. On the other hand, there are at times also astonishing achievements. Think of the visit of Pope Francis to South Sudan. It took a long time to make that visit happen. People needed to be convinced, not only in South Sudan, not only in the diplomatic community, but also in the Vatican itself. There was a lot of skepticism surrounding that visit. Would it really be possible? Can it really work? And is it really worthwhile? It was Pope Francis himself who very much pushed for that visit, wanted it to happen, together with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Now, after all has been done and said, we are looking back on a very successful visit that went beyond the expectations of all those involved. A visit that was applauded not only by the government, but also by the opposition, and last but not least by the diplomatic community involved in the peace negotiations in South Sudan. As mentioned before, a papal envoy is accredited to a country to represent the Holy See, and in a special way the Holy Father in that country. And the beauty maybe of this work lays in the different countries and people that one is allowed to visit and to live in. Personally, I lived in 8 countries, not including Rome, and I have the occasion to see the Church in all its different aspects. And having gone through so many countries and experience has taught me to perceive the true universality, the Catholicism of the Church. The Church, which in its cultural expression can be very different from place to place. The Church I grew up in the Netherlands, is certainly not the Church in which I live today, here in Nairobi. And it is true for each and every place I've gone through. In that, I'm not only a witness to the different cultural and maybe even theological expressions in the church, but it is also that that particular church has influenced me. It has made me understand that many things in the church are accidental and do not touch the substance of my faith. In traveling and living in so many countries, I came to understand that the God I know can reveal himself in very different shapes and under very different circumstances. And it is my task as a papal envoy, yes, even more as a Christian, to come ever closer to that God who is hidden, so to speak, behind all those cultural and linguistic expressions. A bit like the Eucharist itself, where God hides himself behind the signs of bread and wine. The image of God, the true image of God, is of course revealed in Jesus Christ. Who sees me sees the Father, Jesus said. And that same image is then continued in the universal church as the body of Christ. That church will always be a sign that is spoken against. A presence of God that always will be rejected, especially in our times, I would say. In our times, there's an enormous battle going on between the contemporary culture and the church. Our culture, that is, I speak specifically now of the Western culture, influencing heavily all the other cultures in this world. The Western culture is an individualistic culture, based on relativism, rooted in extreme liberalism. In that culture, even the idea of God has become a threat. The mere idea that God exists is a threat to the concept of absolute liberty that our society considers to be the highest good. And coming to think of it, of course it is true. Where God is, an absolute freedom or liberty cannot exist, because God claims space in my life. And the modern liberal and individualistic society, therefore, wants God to be limited to the privacy of the home. This society, of course, cannot completely prohibit the idea of God, which would go against its own teaching of freedom of thought, but it wants to limit it as much as possible so as to be of no threat to the desire for absolute freedom. On the other hand, the desire to limit the presence of the idea of God and of his church leads automatically to an ever more present and ever more present state. In the modern world, the state has become God. In the modern world, it is the state who decides what is good and evil. In the modern state, it is the state that is present everywhere. It watches its citizens on each and every step. In our digitalized society, artificial intelligence analyzes all our movements and comes up with an analysis of who we are through the traces we leave on the internet, through the registrations we do with government offices. In many ways, we have entered into that brave new world where the state, or the ruling power, claims absolute control over each and every citizen. Ironically, the desire for a society in which all citizens claim to be absolutely free seems to lead to a society where true freedom is just an illusion. That is the battlefield of the church, and that is the battle, and that battle is ongoing as we speak. And the church, I have to admit, till now, is ill-prepared for that kind of battle, as it maybe was ill-prepared for the investiture struggle some 900 years ago. Coming to the end of my speech here this morning, I want to come back to the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. I think that in many ways it's still far too early to speak of the end of the pandemic. People are still dying because of the disease, and the World Health Organization is warning people that this pandemic has not disappeared yet and has all the potential to come back with a vengeance. And this is maybe also my criticism on the message for the 56th World Day of Peace of Pope Francis, with the title, "No One Can Be Saved Alone, Combating COVID-19 Together, Embarking Together on Paths of Peace." Though the title seems to suggest otherwise, the text clearly assumes that the pandemic is over and done with. COVID-19, according to this message, seems to be something of the past. That being said, message is worthwhile reading in as far as it calls upon humanity to come together in a spirit of true fraternity. As the title says, no one can be saved alone. And the Pope draws up a few valuable conclusions from this crisis. First, we can no longer think in terms of personal or national interests. We need to think in terms of the common good, recognizing that we belong to the greater community of universal human fraternity. Second, the crises we are facing currently are all interconnected, politically, economically, sociologically, and we need to confront them holistically in a spirit of responsibility and compassion. Third, COVID-19 taught us the importance of adequate public health facilities. Fourth, we need to enhance peace based on justice, eradicating poverty. Fifth, COVID-19 was at least partly caused because of the lack of respect for creation. Remember how that virus came up on a market in China where people were selling certain animals and how it jumped from an animal to a human being, most probably. We need to have a greater care for our common home. We need to have respect for creation. COVID-19 made many more victims among the poor than among the rich. We need to battle that virus of inequality and ensure food and dignified labor for all. And last but not least, we need to develop suitable policies for welcoming and integrating migrants and those whom our society discards. End of my speech. Not yet the end of COVID-19, as I mentioned. Maybe also too early to draw all kinds of conclusions. Maybe it will be up to historians in 50 years' time from now to look back on this period and to understand really what happened. It's a bit like with a painting. If you get too close to a painting, you only see the dots of paint, and we are still very close to the painting. You need to have a certain distance to see the whole picture clearly. But what we can learn from the pandemic is that we need to be more altruistic, to respect each other, to come up for the poor. Basically to live the God values of the gospel in a society. The conflict with church and society, state in a society which in many ways has lost the sensitivity for those kind of values and finds them backward and not fitting in a society which is based on profit and which is basically based on survival of the fittest. Thank you very much.